Namaste, and welcome to all of you to this evening's fourth class in our series on Raja Yoga. This evening's class, we will be talking on the topic of life is a battlefield. And before I begin, I want to mention that toward the end of the class, in the latter portion of the class, I'd like to reserve a little bit of time this evening toward answering your questions. Anything that you may have, particularly those things that pertain to the subjects that we're either going to cover this evening or perhaps some of the subjects that we've covered in the last 3 weeks. And you can write those in, email those in, send them in, and my technical engineer here who's helping me will relay those questions to me, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. If I cannot find the time to answer all of them this evening, I'll certainly email an answer to you in the few days ahead. For this evening's topic, life is a battlefield, the question comes to my mind that I'll pose to you is, have you ever noticed something in life that it seems to be much more easy to form a bad habit than it is to form a good habit? As we fall into these patterns of doing things that we know perhaps are not in our best interest, but it seems so very easy, perhaps diet or behavior of some sort or another. It's very easy to do those things that as we're growing up as children, our parents say, no, don't do that or don't do that, and we have to struggle in order to overcome those habits once we have them implanted within us. And it's a little bit more difficult, seemingly, to form those habits that are really in our best interest. In every religion, I suspect, the path toward perfection, the path toward spiritual attainment, the path toward making our lives better and more godly, it's always referred to as an ascent. It's something that we're lifting ourselves, and the image of climbing a mountain is often used and we even speak of it in the language this way, as we rise up to the challenge. We uplift our consciousness. And this mark of moving upward is very much a trait of the spiritual path. It's certainly no mark of spirituality to ever be tempted and never be tempted in life, or to never fail, or to never have challenges, and often to stumble. I mean, this is something that each of us, if we look back in our lives, we're going to see that there have been times when things have been difficult and we've had perhaps setbacks in life in one form or another. It's not about how many times we stumble or how many times we fail or have setbacks. It's about how often we get up again and again and again to rise to the challenge of whatever that might be toward that goal of perfection. Paramahansa Yogananda had a very lovely saying that he repeated many times in our work here in Ananda Sangha. We say over and over again, a saint is a sinner who never gave up. And it's something that we want to keep in mind. You can say I've often thought in my life when I'm facing a dilemma and I'm thinking, should I do this? Should I do that? Perhaps not so much physical things, but courses of action, you might say, a moral dilemma, not knowing quite what is the right way for me to go. And I often think, well, this way is difficult and this way is easy. Which way should I go? And I've often distrusted myself if the first answer comes, I'm going to take the easy way. I always hesitate a little bit because, there's that saying that we have that, oh, he took the easy way out. And often that usually implies he didn't really do the highest thing. And because oftentimes it seems that the highest thing is the more difficult. Now, why is that? If you read and you remember the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna even asked Krishna this question. he says, what is it? What impels man to act, to sin, to take the lower road? And Krishna answers Arjuna. He says, it is desire, anger it is, enemy of the wise. It's a force. It's as if a force. And the reality is that yes, there is a force. There is a force against which we must exert ourselves. The path to divinity, the path to inner perfection, the path to self-realization requires the devotee to use the power of will. We have to choose. And whenever we make a choice, it's conscious, it's a conscious activity, and there's an element of reaching up. A story that Swami Kriyananda told many years ago, somewhere in the years when I first met him, I remember it from those times. It's a story. It's only a story, not literal, but it illustrates this very point. It was the story that of God creating this world, God creating mankind in this world. And the story goes that God created the first man. He created the world, and he realized that the world was not complete. He needed to place something in there for his own enjoyment, and so he created mankind. So he creates the first man, and the first man is a yogi. He's sitting in meditation, and at the moment of creation of consciousness, he opens his eyes, he looks around the world, notices it, closes his eyes, and goes back into samadhi and merges back into the infinite. End of the story. While God's seen this take place, tried again. He said, well, that didn't work quite right. And it creates another man. Again, that man, the yogi, sitting there in meditation, opens his eyes, looks about this creation, observes it, closes his eyes, merges himself back into samadhi, into the infinite. Now, after a number of repeated tries at this, God finally decides, this is not working, I need to do something else. And he creates something else. Now, you can fill in the blank however you choose, what it might be, but let's say God creates, the man opens his eyes, and he looks out into this world, and it's beautiful. This world is so attractive. It's interesting. It engages his attention. It engages his senses. And it impels him to go out, and I want to say to himself, I want to explore this world and see what this is all about. It's beautiful. I'm interested. In other words, God creates Maya and gives that into the world, that power to attract, that power to enthrall the consciousness, and out into that world God, the yogi goes and forgets from where he came. And so in a sense, this is the situation that we find ourselves in, that this creation has been made for our enjoyment, and as Yogananda said, our entertainment. But oh, how few people are entertained, nor how few people enjoy. We go out into this world, and if there was not something to attract us, if there was not a force that pushed away from divinity to uphold this creation, the natural tendency would be for it to dissolve back into God, because there is also a divine force, that divine force of love that is calling each of us, pulling each of us back into that divine state of oneness. That too is there. And this is, we're being pulled back to our divine state. And so often when we have a spiritual experience, it seems so familiar. As if, yes, this is who I am. I remember. And this is why Patanjali mentions in his Yoga Sutras that the process of self-realization can be described as one of smriti, memory, because it's from where we came. And unless there was some counterforce to propel this creation out into manifestation, there would not be one. Now, in the Western tradition, of course, this is called the satanic force. In a sense, it has a very negative implication with that over time. But it's an outward flowing force that maintains our interest outwardly to seek our satisfaction out in the material world through his senses, through engagement in what in the Eastern tradition is referred to as Maya. Now, the spiritual path is one of retracing our steps back to our original source. But the process of doing that is not one that is necessarily easy or comfortable. And this is why we use the image of it's an ascent. It's something to which we must apply our will. We must engage ourselves in that struggle, which is often is. And this is why it's also sometimes referred to as a battle. And this is the story of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is this story of the two sides, the Kauravas, Pandavas, meeting on that field of Kurukshetra. That Kurukshetra is us. It's reflected in us. And you have the side of the Pandavas, the side of the good qualities. Each of those characters in the Mahabharata are representing traits, positive and negative, within each one of us. And as we know from the story, eventually they come to battle. It must be decided who is the true ruler of the kingdom. Is it Duryodhana, who represents king material desire and all of his relatives, his many, many brothers and allies? Or is it the Pandavas, guided by Krishna as Arjuna's charioteer? These are symbolic representations of the very struggle that takes place in each one of us. That struggle for higher consciousness versus the pull of material consciousness out into the world of finding our satisfaction outside of ourselves. And as we know, we must fight that battle. From the story, of course, Arjuna does not want to fight. He tells Krishna, why? Why is it? Why must I kill my relatives? These souls, these relatives who are dear to me, who I have lived with, who have raised me, who are my nearest and dearest in many cases. Why is it that I must struggle and fight against them, and ultimately, why must I kill them? It seems so cruel. But of course, we must understand this story on the symbolic level. Each one of us, we are a family of traits within each one of us. We have those habits, we have those inclinations, we have those tendencies to rise up, to do great things in life, to act in a dharmic way, and we also know that we have those other tendencies that are pulling us in the opposite direction, that are pulling us into involvement, that are pulling us into egoic action of selfishness. And so each of these traits in the Mahabharata, each of these characters in the Mahabharata are representing one of those soldiers. It's a fascinating story, and unfortunately we don't have time in this class to go in fully into the Mahabharata. But I recommend that you read Swami Kriyananda's interpretation and Master's interpretation of the Mahabharata, because it's embodied within that story is the story of all mankind. Paramahansa Yogananda, in his interpretation of that, it can be interpreted on many different levels. naturally, how we should act in life, we should uphold the good qualities over the negative qualities, how we should reinforce that side of ourself, but also the Mahabharata and the symbols of each of the characters in that great epic also represent what is going on deep within us on a soul level and on an astral level. Each of the characters, besides representing traits, also represent the chakras themselves. Each of the Pandavas representing one of the chakras. And Paramahansa Yogananda said in relation to this a very interesting thing. He said the path to self-realization is attained through our very own nervous system. The path of spirituality, the path of yoga, is a spiritual awakening that happens through the rising energy and consciousness within our own deeper spine. It's an upliftment of consciousness, it's an upliftment of energy from the base of the spine upward toward the brain. And this movement upward, you can see it reflected in our language, as I said already, an upliftment towards something higher, or reaching up. We always look up, isn't it? So when we speak of spiritual realities, we look up. And conversely also, when we find ourselves in a negative state, we tend to slump, we tend to look down. We're reinforcing in this battle between these two forces the upward flow of energy from the base up toward the spine. Now, very interestingly, we see this upward and this downward dichotomy also reflected in the brain and in our states of consciousness. If we go back and remember our anatomy lessons from school, we'll remember that at the base of the brain, we have, you might say, three sections of the brain. We have the base of the brain here where the medulla oblongata is here at the back of the brain. We have the midbrain where various mental processes take place. And we also have that most advanced part of the brain, which is here in the frontal lobes of the brain. And the path of self-realization is one of learning to awaken the forward part of the brain, to transfer our seat of our consciousness from the back of the brain, which is the more animalistic, basic, instinctive side of our consciousness, from the medulla oblongata, from the limbic system, to be able to transfer our seat of awareness from that basic part of the brain forward to the forward part of the brain here at the frontal lobes of the brain. If we look at the back of the brain, we have there the medulla oblongata. Paramahansa Yogananda, in his teachings, made a very, he said something that I've never heard expressed in other traditions of yoga. He said here, at the base of the brain, the medulla oblongata, is seated ego. It is the seat of ego here. And if we think about it, we can see there is a relationship, because it's from this point that the control of the body, the control of the breath, the control of the beating of the heart takes place. It's all controlled here from the medulla oblongata. And in this deep back part of the brain, we find that the instinctual reactions to life take place. This flight or fright reaction when something happens, our instinctive reaction to it is to perhaps anger arises quickly from there. We don't have the conscious processing power in this part of the brain. It's reactive. It tends to be very primitive in that way. And so this also is the seat of the sixth chakra, the Yajna chakra. As we know, there's 7 chakras, and the 6th one here is at the base of the brain in the medulla oblongata. Now, this 6th chakra also has 2 poles to it. It has a negative pole here at the medulla oblongata, but it also has a positive pole, which is here at the point between the eyebrows. Now, if we again go back to our anatomy lessons, here in the forward part of the brain is where we have the higher functions of what it means to be human. That part where intuition arises, our appreciation for aesthetic values, the intellect, the higher functions of thinking, these are all centered here. And you don't find this in the animal brain, but you do find it in the human brain. So the process of spiritual awakening is learning to transfer our seat of awareness from the base of the brain, where the medulla is, to where ego is seated, to the forward part of the brain, to the positive pole of that 6th chakra here at the point between the eyebrows. And you'll find your state of consciousness often will reflect where your consciousness is seated. For example, Yogananda, in his teachings, and in his teachings of self-realization through Ananda Sangha, we speak of 3 states of consciousness: subconsciousness, conscious consciousness, and superconsciousness. Now, subconsciousness is that state, or that more primitive state, that state of semi-awareness, that state that is active when we're in habitual action, doing those things that are ingrained within us. That's more from the subconscious side. The dreaming state, these are seated here in this subconscious part of the brain, or in the back of the brain. So often you find that people go through life and they act in such a way that they don't know quite why they're acting that way. It's just a habitual reaction. Somebody says something, and without even thinking, they become angry. They are impelled, as if it were, as Krishna says, desire it is. They impel people without much self-control. You then have the conscious brain, which we might say is in the midbrain, where various mental processes take place of thinking and so forth. And then you have here, the forward part of the brain, the seat of superconsciousness, that higher awareness, that transcendent awareness that is above merely conscious rationality. That intuitive faculty is seated here at the spiritual eye. And this is why in the yogic tradition much emphasis is made upon focusing our attention here at the spiritual eye. You'll see that whenever you feel a sense of inspiration, whenever you feel a sense of uplifted consciousness, the eyes will naturally go upward. Isn't this so? Watch how you feel when you're sleepy. Your eyes will begin to go down. And so by now, I'm hopeful that all of you have a daily meditation practice. And during that meditation practice, we've emphasized, if you've taken our How to Meditate beginning course, we emphasize the practice of keeping the eyes uplifted. And while you're meditating, watch where your eye level is. The eyes will, right now, when I'm speaking to you, I'm speaking and my eyes are fairly straight. I'm working more through the conscious mind of communicating. If I'm uplifted, my eyes will go upward. But if I tend during meditation to be daydreaming, tend to be a little bit sleepy, my eyes will begin to go down. And this is a state that we find ourselves in at night when we're sleeping, when we're dreaming, and also, unfortunately, when we're meditating, when we're no longer focused on what our purpose is for meditation. So these this position of the eyes is a reflection of where our state of consciousness is. And so consequently, if we want to stimulate a higher consciousness, we can put our attention here at the point between the eyebrows and feel as if you're acting from that point during the day, even in the midst of activity. I don't mean to say to keep your eyes up like this as you're going about your day-to-day activities, but yet inwardly you can feel as if this is your seat, as opposed to back here, where often people who are proud tend to concentrate some energy there, and this phrase of they look down their nose at other people who are proud do that. It's because there's a tightening of energy, a gathering of energy there at the ego center. So keep the attention there at the point between the eyebrows and act in this way, and it very quickly will begin to change your consciousness, and it will very quickly begin to uplift your consciousness. Now, one of the reasons it will do that is because where you put your attention, you tend to create a magnet there. Where your attention is, your energy is there as well. And that energy will tend to magnetically begin to draw the life force up. So consequently, when we're meditating, we keep our attention there, but very strongly, we'll begin to draw life force up to the spiritual eye. And this will begin, sometimes even, you'll begin to see light at that point. This is the point which is referred to in spiritual tradition as the spiritual eye or the third eye. And many people, when they take up the path of yoga, this is just you might say a metaphor, or it's an image, but there's a reality to it which you will experience as you go deeper into your meditation practice. As you do, you'll begin slowly to see a little bit of light there. If you can see light there, concentrate upon that light and try to penetrate into that light. If that is seen perfectly, the spiritual eye is seen perfectly, you'll begin to see a field of blue, a blue field at this point at the spiritual eye. That field of blue, if seen more clearly, you'll see it as a blue field surrounded by a gold light around the edges, a gold ring around that blue. Maybe you see the gold first, then you see the blue inside. And if you concentrate even more deeply and interiorized, you'll find that in the middle of that blue field will be a white light. Perfectly seen, that white light will be a 5-pointed star. Now, this is a universal experience. Whether I in America, you in India, somebody maybe tuning in today from South America or Europe, although culturally different, our backgrounds are different, biologically, and you could say in an astral biology, we're all the same, and we all see this same experience. And so sit to meditate when you do and look up into the spiritual eye. You may not see that perfectly, that spiritual eye perfectly, but do look into the light. And whether you see the light or not, by keeping your attention focused at that point, you'll begin to draw your awareness up to that point. And you'll find, and in the process of doing that, you'll begin to uplift your life force up the spine to the point between the eyebrows. This dichotomy between up and down, overcoming this necessity to use our will, this is the battle of life that all of us face. As I often have used in past classes, I've advised people to remember that life is never exactly perfectly flat and balanced. Think of life as a table. And if you put a ball on that table, You would think if there's very little friction, if the table is absolutely flat, the ball will be still. But in the table of life, you'll find that all things being equal, you put the ball on that table, it'll roll in one direction. And that direction is toward involvement in this world outwardly, because that's that creative story. Again, there's a natural tendency for the life force, for our attention, for our concentration to go outward. And there are times in life when, of course, it will tilt the other way, and those times are when we're inspired, something inspires us. But when we're not inspired, it tends to go the other way. It rarely finds itself perfectly balanced, or if it does, when it does, it finds itself in that state for only a little bit of time. And so remember that. The tendency is for that outward involvement. And this is why the wise person in life will surround himself with influences that help to tilt that table in the other direction. Look in your daily life and recognize that there is this tendency to want to be involved. Our state of mind will go outward to the world outside of ourselves. It's easier to form the bad habit than it is perhaps the good habit. If you understand that principle, we can counteract that by surrounding ourselves with influences that either counteract it directly or influences that inspire us to have an upward flow of life force within the body. So this is the basic beginning point of any yogi in the practice of yoga, is to look into your life and see what is it that is influencing you, and surround yourself with those things that have a positive influence and take you in a positive direction. Physically, your environment, an orderly environment in a very basic sense, is more inducing to calmness than a very cluttered, disorderly environment. Cleanliness, as we mentioned last week in the yamas and niyamas class, this has a positive influence as well. You'll find your physical environment, your social environment. Who influences you the most? Oftentimes it's friends, the people with whom you associate. Look at that. The association of the environment in terms of music, the books you read, the influences that you place in your life. Television, for example, can have a very deleterious effect or influence, especially if you're habituated to it. Surround yourself instead with those things that remind you of positive things. Now, habit itself can be either positive or negative. If we just, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, I mentioned each of those characters is representative of traits within us. And one of those, I'll just mention in this regard, is Dronacharya. Now, if you remember Dronacharya was the guru, the military arts guru of both the Pandavas, the good qualities, the good characteristics, the good traits within us, and he was the guru also of the Kauravas, those things that were negative. So remember, he representing, and the implication of that is that habit trains both sides of us. It trains the good qualities and it trains the negative qualities. But when the battle came of Kurukshetra, on which side did Dronacharya stand? The tendency is that habits tend toward the negative side. It's never perfectly balanced. He could have gone on the other side, but generally speaking, habits tend toward the negative, although it can be used in a positive way as well. Now I'm going to move very quickly now toward our questions, but before I do, I would like to give one tip for you during your meditation practice. As I said, I hope all of you now are meditating regularly each day. Begin your meditation practice when you sit the next time. Practice the techniques that will help you to calm the breath. I might mention that the breath, as I said, is controlled by biologically, physiologically, from the medulla oblongata. Now, if we control the breath, we begin to relax the breath. The breath becomes slower, the breath becomes calmer. This also has the effect of calming that seat of ego, which is associated with the medulla, and the medulla is biologically what controls the breath. So as we calm the breath, the ego itself becomes calmer. So next time, watching the breath in the practice of Hong Sa, if you're practicing the technique we teach in our level 1 class, watch the breath until it becomes very slow, very calm. And while you're doing this, keep your attention focused at the point between the eyebrows. And let that be the seat. Your focus of attention is on the breath, but your seat of the focus, you're focusing from, you might say, is you're focusing from the point between the eyebrows. Your attention is there, and the eyes are uplifted, and as you watch the breath, you can even feel the breath coming into and out of the body through the upper nasal passages behind the point between the eyebrows. This will help keep your physical attention at that point until finally the breath slows. Ideally, you'll feel a great deal of peace, you'll feel a sense of calmness, and also perhaps joy. Now, when you get very calm, come to the end of your practice of Hong Sa, of watching the breath, by inhaling with a deep breath. Take a deep breath, inhale, and hold the breath. And as you hold the breath, focus your attention very deeply at the point between the eyebrows, and look into the breath look into the point between the eyebrows with your breath retained. And look there, and try to see a light, and focus on that light. Hold the breath 20, 25 counts, or whatever is comfortable for you, but hold it for a bit of time, and then release the breath slowly out, but keep your attention at the point between the eyebrows. And do this again 2 or 3 times. Inhale, hold, focus your attention at the point between the eyebrows. Exhale, and keep your attention there. And doing this 2 or 3 times, then forget the breath. But keep your attention now, looking in the point between the eyebrows, into the spiritual eye, and feel the peace that was stimulated by the practice of Hong Sa, or that feeling of peace of just simply watching the breath and relaxing the body, mind, and the ego. And enjoy that, but keep the concentration at that point. Try this at the conclusion of your Hong Sa practice in this coming week. Now I'd like to move on to address a few of the questions. My first question that is presented to me is how do we know what is the right thing to do at any given moment? I think this is an excellent question, whoever it was that asked that, because it is a central question of life. And it is a central question that each one of us ask ourselves, perhaps not consciously, but below the conscious level, each time we act in some way or another. Something happens in life and we respond to it. Now, much of our response to life is somewhat subconscious and below the conscious level. Our shoelace comes untied. Oh, we have to tie that shoelace, but we don't think about it too much. By now, as adults, we know how to tie our shoelaces without too much conscious effort. Much of life is like that. We simply react in a subconscious way to situations in life. But there is a difference between reacting to life, whatever comes to us in day-to-day activity, challenges, and there is a difference between that and responding to life. Reaction, response. Response implies some sort of conscious activity, choosing to act in a certain way. And the more that we as humans can act in a way that's responsive, the more elevated will be our consciousness. This is the difference between a human and an animal. Animals react, humans should respond. And I don't know if we always do, but we should. We respond to what comes to us. Now, that's the first step, you could say a critical step on the spiritual journey, is learning to be conscious enough to respond. Now, the second part of that question, though, is we can respond in many different ways. Sometimes they're good responses and sometimes they're perhaps not so good. But start with learning to respond. Now, so the second part of the question is, how do we know what is the right thing to do at any given moment? This is something that your response needs to be guided, one, by experience. Your experience should tell you a little bit of what is right, what is wrong, or what is, let's say, right and wrong. Maybe we use words such as what is going to be helpful, what is going to be less helpful, what is going to improve my condition, or somebody else's, what is not. This is a story that I'm reminded of. A little boy was walking with his grandfather, and he asked the grandfather, "Grandfather, you're very wise. How did you come to be so wise?" And the grandfather says to his grandson, he says, by making many good choices, many good decisions in life. And the little boy thinks about that for a while, and then he says, "But grandfather, how did you learn to make so many good choices?" And the grandfather says, "By making many bad choices." And often this is the case. Now, ideally, you make bad choices and then you learn by it. It's not wrong, or it's not, like I said earlier in the discourse, there's no mark of spirituality to never make a wrong choice. The important thing is to make the wrong choice, if you do, and to then learn from it. So that's the first thing that we do, is we learn what is a better choice and what is a less good choice. But another guiding principle is, perhaps it's an answer to what is the secret of right action, which we're going to be speaking about. I believe there's a discourse on this next week. That action which leads you to greater soul freedom. Now, that's a broad term, that's a broad definition, but what leads to freedom versus what leads to binding? The ego is binding. Being able to overcome those attachments of the identification of the soul to the body, that is binding. That is the definition of ego. So those things that are freeing to oneself, those things that expand our sympathies to include others, those things that make us, in a spiritual sense, larger, versus those things that make us more contractive and selfish and smaller. Now, codes of behavior cannot be written such as 10 commandments. Never do this, never do that, never do this. You cannot define moral behavior in strict outward codes of action. They need to be understood intuitively in terms of direction. Those things that uplift one, and you feel a sense if you have to act this way or this way, which one feels more expansive? Which one gives you a sense of greater freedom? Which one brings joy? Which one brings contraction? Which one makes you feel smaller? Now these sometimes a bit difficult to understand, but because this comes from experience. But on the other hand too, in a practical sense, you should look about and seek wise counsel from other people who have more experience than you. People that you trust, people who you respect. Ask them, what would they do? Often in my deliberation, should I do this or should I do that? I don't know. But what I do is I say, what in my life, I lived with in the presence of Swami Kriyananda for 40 years. And I think about him, I think, what would Swami do in this situation? What would he do? And then I mentally imagine myself doing that. And I said, would he be pleased or not pleased? And I do the same thing with Master Paramahansa Yogananda. Would Master approve of this as my understanding of him, or would he not be? And another thing I would ask, how do I see myself? Do I feel this is an honorable thing to do or a less honorable thing to do? Now those might be moral dilemmas, but in more practical terms, is it helpful? Is it useful? Is it going to, how is it going to affect another person? Am I doing something to please myself, or is it to please others? Now, there's nothing wrong with pleasing yourself, but not at the expense of others, you see. So you have to judge these things from inside. Now, I don't mean to spend too much time on this because I have other questions, but I would recommend I believe it's the Friday after the coming soon. Look on the schedule on the Friday night classes. We're going to be having one coming up called Secret of Right Action, or a title very similar to that. And I'll be able to go into this very particular topic at that class. A second question is, how can we reprogram the subconscious mind so that it supports our spiritual effort? Another excellent question, because it's very similar to that that topic I mentioned of how set your environment in such a way that it supports your spiritual effort. So consequently, if we speak of the outward environment, let's say our home, for instance, or wherever it is that you sit to meditate, if you arrange your meditation spot so that it's very sattvic, orderly, clean, nice, pleasing, harmonious colors, nice altar that prompts you to naturally feel devotional, perhaps a picture of Guru there, or whatever, a murti that's dear to you, whatever it might be, the environment itself is uplifting and stimulating. But now, this question is taking it a little bit further. It's saying, how do we reprogram the inside environment to support our spiritual effort? How do we reprogram the subconscious mind so that it supports our spiritual effort? This essentially is the nature of habit. What you're asking is, how do we reprogram the subconscious mind to have good habits? Now, if we ask the question, what is a habit, really? Think of the image of a stream of water. A stream of water coming down a hillside. The stream of water, when it first comes, coming down a bare hillside, it will create a little channel. And the next time it rains, the water will begin to follow that channel. Now the monsoon season is coming, heavier rain, that channel, more water, it begins to form a deeper and deeper channel until finally the channel, all the water is focused into that channel that comes down to that hillside. This is the force of habit. Habit is the same way. We begin to, by our actions, we begin to channelize the life force that flows through us into certain patterns. So consequently, like that psychology experiment we read about in school, Dr. Pavlov had his dog and he would ring a bell and he would feed the dog. Ring a bell, feed the dog. Finally, he rang the bell, but he didn't give food to the dog, but he noticed that the dog, at the ringing of the bell, would begin to salivate. And so the dog, he trained the dog just by ringing the bell to salivate. Well, this is how it is for many of us in life. Certain things happen, responses, and our habits make us do certain actions. But there is a counter principle to this as well, and this will also be a subject of one of our question. We'll go into this more deeply in a few weeks in one of our later classes. Action that is taken in life without much conscious attention is much less binding, much less habit forming than action done with conscious effort. So consequently, if we want to reprogram our habits, let's say, reprogram our conscious mind, if we use strong mental affirmation to do the counter, we can very quickly neutralize that which has been implanted into us very casually. For example, as an example, I remember at one point when I was staying somewhere, I would go to work every morning and I would walk a certain route. I would walk the blocks left, right, and so on to get where I was needing to go. And I would walk the same way every day. But then it would occur to me, I'm going to walk a different route. It was a little bit of habit to walk the same route every day. I didn't think about it too much, but it was not very difficult for me to change, you see, and I could change that. And so I tried to do other things. And that was not a very deep habit, but yet there are other things we do in our life. When we repeat them, they become very ingrained because we pull in the senses, we pull in many emotional associations with them, and those habits repeated can become very strong. So the best way to not form a habit is to catch it real quickly before it's ingrained. There was a story from Paramahansa Yogananda's life where when he came to the United States in 1920, he wanted to become familiar with the culture, and obviously you go to a new country, there are different environments, there are different foods, different things to drink, and so he tried this and he tried that, and he tried ginger ale. Now ginger ale is a soft drink, it's a sweet drink, and he said, "Oh, that's very nice. I like ginger ale." And so he would sometimes drink ginger ale. And then one day he was expecting to have some ginger ale, and it wasn't there. And he says, "Where's my ginger ale?" And immediately he caught himself and he said, he saw that a small habit was beginning to form. And then he said, Mr. Ginger Ale, no more Mr. Ginger Ale for me. And he never drank ginger ale again. It wasn't that he disliked ginger ale, it was that and it wasn't really a strong habit, but he saw that something was becoming that, and he was, I think, demonstrating for it so that I could tell this story. And years later, he was demonstrating, catch it right at the beginning, and then it's not so hard to change. But that's a short answer. Again, I'm going to suggest that you come back in one of the future classes. We're going to be discussing this topic of habits and affirmations of how to change habits and that the principles that are involved with that. And we're going to go into take a whole class itself to address that topic. Now the final question, unless some of you write in, is what are some practical ways we can develop and strengthen our willpower? This is the third of three excellent questions that have been addressed today. And again, we're going to go into this very topic again a little bit more in a future class when we talk about magnetism and will. But just briefly, let me say, I think one of the a practical way we can develop and strengthen our willpower is to do what you say you're going to do. Swami Kriyananda was very adamant about this. He said he demonstrated in his life, if he said he was going to do something, he made every effort possible to actually do it. So his actions conformed to his words. Now, you could take that further, so our actions might even conform with our thoughts. But try to be true to your word, and you will find, as we discussed in last week's class on Yama, that your word and your will develop power if you do that which you say you're going to do. Now, you can also, as an exercise, strengthen the will. Take small things in life and set a challenge for yourself. Not something beyond your abilities, but something that is you are capable, but is going to engage effort on your part. Set yourself those challenges and then do it. And then, as time goes on, begin to increase the difficulty of those challenges. And you'll find that in this way, that your power of will begin to increase. On a deeper level, you might say a energetic level, the will should be thought of as a muscle. It's something that through the use of will, we strengthen it. It's absolutely necessary to have will and to strengthen the will to be able to make spiritual progress. There's no such thing as total lack of will. On the most base level, Paramahansa Yogananda said that it even takes some measure of will to breathe. Now, we don't think of it that way, but it's true. Every action, there's an element of will, and our job is to strengthen that will. The energization exercises that I hope you've learned by now, Paramahansa Yogananda's energization exercises, are often thought of as a physical exercise, perhaps to strengthen the body, make it more healthy, stimulate the flow of energy. But you should think of these exercises as will strengthening exercises. Remember the phrase that accompanies those exercises. The greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. And so what we're doing is when we're using the body and we're using the life force within us as a tool by which we can strengthen the will. We do this physically, but then through that process of strengthening, we learn to do it energetically within. By the use of our will, we are able to accomplish miracles. In the Bible, if I say to the mountain, be moved, so it will be moved. When a saint, his word is his bond, and the world conforms to the word of a great master. And so practice this in your life, is make whatever it is that you say you're going to do, make it an expression, do it well, do wise things, be guided intuitively, divinely to do the right thing. But if you make up your mind to do something and you say you're going to do it, do it. and you'll find that your will is increased and a power begins to come into you. And it is the same power of doing things outwardly in the world that we use to affect this process of self-realization within each one of us.